Hello and welcome to another episode of Where Will You Stand? Hopefully new and improved. I got a brand new microphone and a nice camera for a little bit of video. And got a little piece of history that I want to read. It's the 10 points of the Nuremberg Code. Came out of the trials and tribulations of all the war crimes and absurdities that came out of all those Nazi trials. And I feel like it might have some relevance to today. There's a lot of arguments that it doesn't, and we'll see. You can make your own viewpoints on that. Let's get into this one. So, first off, the voluntary consent of human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should also be situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, like Bill de Blasio's French fries and burgers. Anyway, and should have sufficient knowledge of comprehension of the elements and subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision. This latter element requires that before the acceptance of an affirmative decision by the experimental subject, keyword experimental, there should be made known to him the nature, duration, and purpose of the experiment, the method and means by which it is to be conducted, all inconveniences and hazards reasonably to be expected, and the effects upon his health or person which may possibly come from his participation in the experiment. The duty and responsibility for ascertaining the quality of the consent rests upon each individual who initiates, directs, or engages in the experiment. It is a personal duty and responsibility which may not be delegated to another with impunity. The experiment should be as such to yield fruitful results for the good of society, unprocurable by any other methods or means of study, and not random and unnecessary in nature. The experiment should be designed and based on the results of animal experimentation and a knowledge of natural history of the disease or other problem, under study that anticipated results will justify the performance of the experiment. The experiment should be conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. No experiment should be conducted where there is a priori reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur, except perhaps in those experiments where the experimental physicians also serve as subjects. So that means if the physician is experimenting on themselves, people can do whatever they want to their own person. The degree of risk to be taken should never exceed that determined by humanitarian importance of the problem to be solved by the experiment. Like, we're in one big giant experiment, still ongoing 2 years later. Proper preparations should be made and adequate facilities provided to protect the experimental subject against even remote possibilities of injury, disability, or death. The experiment should be conducted only by scientifically qualified persons. The highest degree of skill and care should be taken and required through all stages of the experiments of those who conduct or engage in the experiment. During the course of the experiment, the human subject should be at liberty to bring the experiment to an end if he has reached the physical or mental state where the continuation of the experiment seems to him to be impossible. During the course of the experiment, the scientist in charge must be prepared to terminate the experiment at any stage, if he has probable cause to believe in the exercise of good faith, superior skill, and careful judgment required of him that a continuation of experiment is likely to result in injury, disability, or death to the experimental subject. Now, one of the really big things is the vaccine that we have now I don't want to talk too much about it, but it is basically, we're basically in just one giant clinical trial. We're all guinea pigs, and it is not technically approved. It's been post-date approved, which means it's not going to be fully approved by the FDA for another few years, I believe. Now, there's been all kinds of people like this guy from the Washington Post that writes opinion pieces that contradict everything that basically constitutes good faith and good judgment, and completely derails reality and common sense. We know all the things that we've always known, and I don't know if you've realized, but if you could take a look back, just a few years ago, things were undeniably different than they are now. It only took 2-3 years to almost radically change every aspect of our daily lives. And I feel like, especially as Americans, the pride that we feel as a nation has just been dwindled away into nothing. And things like this from the Washington Post, this guy's opinion, I do not agree with this opinion. That is kind of why I wanted to share this specific post. It's by David Moscrop at the Washington Post. His opinion: Canada must confront the toxic freedom convoy head on. He goes along, says, long lines of truckers calling themselves Freedom Convoy are headed across Canada to Ottawa from the west and from the east. Estimates of the size of the convoy vary, but I won't estimate. And he just says some absurd shit and some more absurd shit. So, further down, those taking part in their way, ostensibly, to the protest pandemic measures, including vaccine mandates for truckers, but that's just the tip of the spear. The leaders of the group is promising to remain peaceful, but the convoy is made up of many individuals that and far-right groups that have embraced the convoy as a Canadian version of January 6th rioting in the United States. The movement shares an affinity with Trumpist, toxic authoritarianist policies. Indeed, the convoy has received attention from Donald Trump Jr. Police and security services are preparing for the worst as experts express concern about the online vitriol, and journalists covering the convoy are harassed. Time and time again, we learn the lesson, or at least come across it, that teaches us that rage-soaked anti-government types can't be reasoned with. This time around, the convoy has produced an incoherent memorandum of understanding, premised upon the misunderstanding of government and absurd demands. Of course, the memo should be ignored. It's the product of a temper tantrum. But doing nothing is a risky, suboptimal strategy. Now, how much of a temper tantrum have we had from the left? I know that this guy is talking about something that has to do with Canada, but still, they're a very left-leaning country politically, and if you want to take a look at what happened for the past 4 years, or 5 years actually, it was just a huge temper tantrum from the left, and it's just them stomping their feet saying, I don't like Orange Man bad, and I don't actually like Donald Trump that much, but still, he did things that he felt as if were helping the country, and they did. We had a better economy, we had whole lot of things going on for us. We're actually energy independent for the first time in several years. And this guy goes on to say, the convoy, by and large, a French group. And I like how everybody that's even remotely close to being a minority, they call them a fringe group. Like it's gonna be, like they're just writing, oh, it's just a small group of people. This is hardly anyone. Well, even though it's a small percentage, the numbers quoted were only numbers for the Canadian truck force, And I believe the number was somewhere in the ballpark of 12,000 truckers. That's a lot, especially if they follow through with the mandate and they actually fire many of these truck drivers. A lot of these truck drivers actually come over the border into our country and vice versa, and they're instituting a 2-week quarantine. And all these guys are in their truck. They're not spreading all this shit around, even if it was such a serious situation. I feel like we rely on them far more than we would ever need to take their jobs away from them. Now, an unfortunate minority in which a further minority of insidious extremists lurk. Yeah, a guy sitting in a truck hauling you everything that you get at your Whole Foods is the insidious extremist. They are bolstered by support from conservative politicians and certain blustery media voices. The guys that actually care about freedom and independence, and usually they're called insidious extremists. And most of these guys, one of their biggest things is leave me the hell alone, let me make my own decisions. Now, a lot of them, even as a national fringe, pose an outsized problem. They're too big to ignore and too unreasonable to placate insofar as they represent a broader challenge. Either way, we shouldn't ignore or placate them. Rather, the convoy and its supporters must be met with a counter-movement that refuses to give them an inch, but instead focuses national, subnational, and local efforts on true threats to liberty, which do exist. Now, the only people taking liberties away are the socialistic far left. There's actually a lot of left policies that I can understand and I can get behind. But when it comes to stripping away rights that people already had, especially here in America, where we have all of the rights, inalienable rights given to us by the Constitution from our founders. And you can talk about colonization like this guy does at the end of his rant. But no. Now, where is that? Yeah, the convoy speaks of threats to liberty. It could be close to something if the participants weren't so far off. Threats to liberty are rampant in Canada, but not because of vaccine mandates. Rather, it is income and wealth inequality, worker exploitation, gendered, religious, racialized, and other forms of hate violence, ongoing settler colonization, and other forms of structural marginalization and oppression that compromises liberty, same as it ever has. You know what I say to that? To each their own. Let everyone take care of themselves. Stop thinking about all these gender politics and all this craziness. Honestly, we just need to get the bearings and try to be normal again. We get all these insane ideologies shoved down our throats, and all these people that live in rural areas that are prominently more right-leaning, the biggest thing that we have is leave us alone and let us make our own decisions. Why is that so hard to understand? They feel as if these Democrats sitting in their cities, they feel like when they have an idea that might help them in their lives, that they should force it on everybody else, and they think everybody lives like they do, and that's just completely and totally not true. And then they're the ones that have been out of touch for a long time, and it's only getting worse and worse and worse. And I was talking about the Nuremberg trials a little while ago. It has a lot to do with experiments and other things. And look at Bill Gates over here. This is another post from The Nation. This one's a little long. I'm not actually going to read the whole thing. But while the poor get sick, Bill Gates just gets richer. I read this a little while ago. I thought it was very interesting. This guy actually has a whole lot. They complain about Trump a lot. They do go over a lot of the money, some of it. Here we go. The foundation recently reported a $40 million stake in CureVac, one of the dozens of investments the foundation reports having to companies working on the COVID vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, or manufacturing. According to the National Analyst of Foundation's most recent tax return website and various SEC filings, the foundation has also announced that it will leverage a portion of its $2.5 billion strategic investment fund to advance its work on COVID. These investments, around more than $250 million, show that the world's most visible charity and one of the world's most influential voices in the pandemic response is in a position to potentially reap considerable financial gains from the COVID-19 pandemic. Gates reported investments in CureVac alone may have already delivered tens of millions of dollars in shareholder value for the nonprofit Gates Foundation. Even though Trump's bid for the CureVac failed, the company's stock skyrocketed 400% in 2 days after going public in August. Revelations of the Gates Foundation financial stake in COVID-19, which Bill Gates does not appear to have publicly disclosed in dozens of recent media appearances, speak to broader criticisms about the lack of transparency and the foundation's increasingly central role in the pandemic. They have had a central role in the pandemic and the vaccine rollout since day one, honestly. They're just being more public about it. Who are they accountable to? Do they even have a governance structure that's clear? No, they don't, because how many of these politicians in the United States do you believe invested in stock for Pfizer, Moderna, any of the Bill Gates' stock, many different stocks that have to do with vaccine production and development? And now everybody's calling for more money to be invested into all of these vaccines and vaccine rollouts and study. And not that far after, they were talking about, Gates was talking about in an interview that he's worried about a smallpox pandemic outbreak, maybe a terrorist attack.